Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to Brookings India. My name is Constantino Xavier. I'm a fellow here in the Foreign Policy Program. And it's great to welcome you all for what is another book seminar, or generally what we call a Foreign Policy and Security Seminar here at Brookings India. It's something we started early this year with Professor Modi from the US, who shared with us a work about the European Union and why the euro was the worst possible initiative the EU could have taken, which has actually endangered European integration. It was a very provocative, interesting discussion we had, equally with a full room a few months ago. Today it's a great pleasure to host Mr. Raghvendra Singh for what's promising to be an equally provocative discussion for a full house, and a very timely discussion on a wonderful, deeply researched historical book, which I will invite you to buy and read. 500 pages on India's lost frontier, on one of India's many lost frontiers, I would say. We're talking about many of these today. And it's a book based on scholarship, which is one of the criteria we have in these seminars, that we have people presenting work which is solid, which is new, which is based on evidence, in this case on historical archives, on newly declassified files and materials, which allow us to have really a new glimpse into the decisions behind the joining of the Northwest Frontier Province into the Pakistani state after 1947. It's a story which has been touched upon in some of the literature, but not to the extent to which this book goes. So it's a great pleasure to host you, sir. And in particular, I have said, and before I go to the formal introduction of your long CV and your important contribution to the areas of heritage, culture, and also as the former Director General of the National Archives of India, it's particularly important because it forces us to, I think, emphasize the importance of history in policymaking, and the importance of any type of evidence-based research. Could be economics, could be data, ethnography. We have many methods in which we can understand reality, but one is through the light of the archives, in which we really revisit the Indian state, or various states in this case, which were looking at a certain issue area, had different views, and we now fortunately have that evidence to revisit, reconstruct the processes behind this. This is very important because, as you know, we live in a time of not only fake news, which I think actually are not the greatest threat, but I think you call it in one of your last chapters, limited knowledge, or very limited and partial knowledge, anecdotal, political knowledge. And about many of the past figures which crafted this Republic of India, which are again in the limelight, whether it's Nehru, Patel, they've been thrown around, I think, quite superficially and accused or glorified in many superficial ways. And in many ways, that is a result of the lack of scholarship we have about these figures, including figures like Prime Minister Nehru, who was the longest-serving Prime Minister in this country. So it's great to see many younger people doing this work. It's very good to see not so young people, but I think young in mind and young in methodology, young in approach, which is what you really embody in this book, sir. Going to the roots of the issues, bringing them to us, and provoking a debate which is informed about the past. What we'll do today is therefore responding to what for National Security Advisor Shiv Shankar Menon, who's here and will join us for the panel, mentioned as one of the biggest gaps in the discussions we're having, in particular about foreign and security policies. Let me quote from a JNU talk you gave in 2014, if I'm not mistaken, sir, in which you said, in terms of Indian scholarship, and I quote Mr. Menon here, there's very little of quality, and he mentioned of that quality, he actually mentions Srinath Raghavan's book, I think the first book he wrote on Nehru. There's very little of that quality, which is empirically based on the historical record, and which suggests the real policy dilemmas, choices, that we in the government face. What I'm asking for is a combination of theory and practice that is rare and difficult when we are so archivally challenged, as the expression turned, to put it mildly. Those are your words. And I think archivally challenged is really the greatest problem we face today. So it's a great pleasure to host Mr. Raghvendra Singh. He's an IAS officer of the 1983 batch of the West Bengal cadre. He's a former DG, Director General of the National Archives of India, and former Secretary of Ministry of Textiles and the Ministry of Culture, just retired from the Ministry of Textiles. He conceptualized and curated the National Museum of Indian Cinema in a refurbished heritage building, Gulshan Mahal in Mumbai. Previously, Mr. Singh also served as Secretary to the Leader of Opposition, Rajya Sabha 2004 to 2009, and Private Secretary to the Union Minister of External Affairs, Mr. Jaswant Singh. He's an avid writer and was also Director of the Indian Cultural Center in Berlin between 2000 and 2002. So wedded to heritage, culture, history, I think in many ways through your career and also through your scholarship. What we'll do today, therefore, is I think we'll have Mr. Singh present his book, give him his time to present the main lessons of this book and the main views in this book for maybe 25 minutes, sir. And then we'll have a discussion which will extend up to the present and future with a panel I'll introduce at a later stage with Mr. Menon and Dr. Shanti Maria de Souza, in which we're going to try to bring this to the present and the future. So in many ways we'll try then in an hour to bridge 1901, which is the creation of the province of the Northwestern Frontier Province, to 2021, and see what's in all of this for India, India's interests in Pakistan and Afghanistan in the future. Sir, up to you.
Thank you. In fact, it's quite a coincidence how this book came about. I've done nothing to facilitate this, but Ambassador Menon is sitting here. And when he was our High Commissioner in Pakistan, that's the time I got an opportunity, a rare opportunity, I should say, to go 4x4 across the Thar from Rajasthan into Sindh, and so via Mirpur Khas to Hyderabad, to Karachi, and then to Las Bela in Balochistan. Not many people have done it, so to that extent I feel lucky enough. So the idea thereafter was to start collecting material to write something on Balochistan. But while I was doing that, I came across interesting material which I think historians or people who are interested in history across the border perhaps didn't find it convenient enough to write. And in India we found this place too remote, which actually it is not, to write about. So it took me a couple of years from 2007 onwards, not really couple, more than that, to sort of put this book together. The whole issue on which I'm going to speak out here is the issue of historiography. Because when independence came with partition, it's thereafter been made out that the British wanted that there should be one unified India, and that there were two Qoms, and the two-nation theory proffered by Jinnah actually came true, especially in 1946-47, and therefore the British were actually forced to divide India. And this kind of a historiography, no one's really seriously questioned it. There's one point I would like to actually flag, and that is that when the British announced in February of 1947 to depart finally, they had actually set a date, which was June end 1948. And there was this whole idea of a phased withdrawal. But suddenly they started to think in terms of a date around December, which again was advanced to August 1947. Now when this was done, obviously then the things had to move very fast. So I would once in a while wonder what was this, tearing hurry all about to sort of take over power, and in the process, this partition which took place and the migration of population which ensued. So many people got killed and uprooted and what have you. I mean, was there really any crying need for it? Now, there were a lot of consequences because of this date getting advanced. And these consequences were not unintended. They were very intended consequences. And that's the reason why the date was advanced. And this, time and again, I felt, having read whatever I could manage to lay my hands on, and that's not only related to Northwest Frontier Province, it's related to Balochistan, to Afghanistan, to Kashmir, Gilgit, Baltistan, and I'll talk about it. Now, when we talk of Pakistan, Pakistan consisted of, or was supposed to consist of, Northwest Frontier Province, Balochistan, West Punjab, Sindh, and East Bengal. Now, if we take it one by one, we had a Congress government on 15th of August in Northwest Frontier Province when this province went into Pakistan. The natural question or the corollary is, why did it so happen? Balochistan, of which Kalat was then 80%, once upon a time it was coterminous with whole of Balochistan, and then over a period of time the British nibbled at those territories like the way they nibbled at the territories of Kashmir Darbar. Actually, on 15th of August declared its independence. Kalat actually unfurled the Khan of Kalat unfurled his national flag on that day from the Jama Masjid of Kalat, and the khutbah was read in his name. And Jinnah and Pakistan actually recognized the independent status of Kalat. We didn't recognize it as independent country. Why? We'll come to that later. As far as Kashmir is concerned, what POK is, what northern area is, all part of that. So that was not there at all. On March, around third week of March, till third week of March 1947, in Punjab, there was a government which was not a Muslim League government. Which way Sindh will go was not known. East Bengal eventually became Bangladesh. So Pakistan was not such a cohesive entity. Even now, Urdu as a language which is there, I mean, it's more of a federation. It's a learned language. There's incipient nationalism in Sindh, in Balochistan, in Northwest Frontier Province. And it was in East Bengal subsequently. So what happened in 5-6 months actually ended up deciding the fate of our country. And that was decided largely by a whole lot of actors, especially because of the men on spot. Just to give you one small example of Kashmir. Now, Gilgit Agency is a huge swathe of territory. It just suddenly vanished without a trace from the Kashmir Darbar territories around the first week of November. No one actually talks about it in India. Nehruji was a prodigious writer. I mean, he would write 5 letters in a particular day relating to Jammu and Kashmir for years to come after 1947. But you do not find a single mention of Gilgit Agency or Baltistan in his letters. I do not know why. Rather, the only mention if I find in his letter, one letter which he wrote to Joseph Corbell, which was in late 1948, it is to say that I am actually forfeiting my claim to Gilgit. I mean, I was amazed to see that letter. I mean, why would he want to forfeit his claim to Gilgit? Even now, Chitral, which was a part of Kashmir Darbar, doesn't get shown in our map. I mean, if we are claiming Saksham Valley, if we are claiming POK, if we are claiming Gilgit as part of our map, why are we not claiming Chitral? So these are all things one should ponder and one should try and find out and one should write about. Coming to Northwest Frontier, Congress had a comfortable majority when provincial elections took place in 1946. But what happens when Mountbatten comes? Mountbatten comes in March of 1947, and usually people think that Mountbatten was one person who was flamboyant, who was not a really highly respected Navy man, and there are so many other facets of his character which get discussed about. But while going through most of the documents, I got this feeling time and again that he has been actually quite critical to the way our history got shaped. On the issue of Northwest Frontier Province, within 10 days of his coming in, he sends his chief of staff, who was with Churchill earlier, Pug Ismay, to Peshawar. And he meets this gentleman who's the governor there, Olive Caro. And Caro says that, you see, this kind of an unnatural situation can't go on here. It's a kind of a bastard situation, which Pug Ismay then actually called this, because you cannot have a so-called Congress, in brackets, Hindu government in an overwhelmingly Muslim province. 92-93% of that province was Muslim. And Ismay comes back, he actually briefs Mountbatten, and Mountbatten then talks to Nehru. And Nehru, by 15th of April, by the time the governor's conference is taking place in Delhi, has already come around to the idea of holding an election in Northwest Frontier Province. I mean, can you imagine the election to be held on the same issue of Pakistan as it was held in 1946? Why would Nehru agree? Then the chief minister of that province is called, and he comes down to Delhi. And he comes down at a time when there are riots going on in Dera Ismail Khan. People are dying. And why is he called? So that the whole idea is to give that thing a veneer of consultation. And this I got to know because when the minutes were circulated, obviously this would not be mentioned because the minutes would go to Nehru too. But when Mountbatten is sending his report to the Whitehall, he mentions this. He says, look, Nehru wanted it like that, so we did it. So by 18th of April, it's decided that there'll be another election which needs to be held in this province. I mean, can you imagine that around this time, if the BJP wins in MP or in Rajasthan, which it has, then would elections be held in those two states? It will obviously not be. So what was the need to hold an election over there? And that too without consulting the most important person of that area, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. I mean, he was one of the most senior leaders of the Congress, and his band of people, the Khudai Khidmatgars, for all practical purposes, was the only mass-based Muslim organization which Congress had in India. And in Northwest Frontier Province, it was not Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan who needed the Congress, it was the Congress who needed him. And yet, you go over his head and decide on holding an election without consulting him. Then he goes, Mountbatten goes, comes to Northwest Frontier around 28th of April. He goes back on the 1st of May and decides, no, election will not do. We will have a referendum there. And then he and Nehru go to Simla. And in Simla, the plan of partition gets changed, and it is there for the first time that he gets to know of the date being advanced of India's partition and independence. And all this is happening in Simla, where there is practically no other leader from the Congress. So then they come back, and again Nehru goes over the head of all the people, even Gandhi, because Gandhi was opposed to the idea of referendum, and so was Ghaffar Khan. And so it's decided that a referendum it is, and around the 8th of June, after the partition plan has been announced, Ghaffar Khan says that I don't want to actually take part in this. Now imagine a situation where Ghaffar Khan now can't even owe his allegiance to India, because he knows that his piece of territory is not going to be in India. So how is he going to owe his allegiance to India? It's a very piquant situation for him. And that's why he says that, you know, you all have thrown me to the wolves, so to speak. In fact, I was reading the other day a letter which Patel actually writes to Sheikh Abdullah. And this was actually in response to a press conference. This was obviously before 1950 sometime, I think 48 or 49, when Sheikh Abdullah had gone ballistic on government of India and had said so many things, one of them being that he wants an independent Kashmir, to which, and he had raised some other questions, to which Patel had written to him. And the question, one of the questions was that you all actually had not done enough to save Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, apart from many other things which Sheikh Abdullah had said. To which Patel actually replied, because there was hardly any love lost between Patel and Sheikh Abdullah, and at that time Kashmir was a parish which belonged to Nehru. I mean, he would not let Patel come anywhere near Kashmir. So on this particular question he writes, and in a very, how should I say, sarcastic way, he says that for that you need to ask your dear friend, because it was Nehru who was actually supporting Sheikh Abdullah, as we all know. So he writes that for that you need to ask your dear friend Nehru as to why it happened. Don't ask me. So Nehru was privy to all kinds of things which had gone on then, and therefore 2 or 3 paragraphs from my book which make for sad reading actually. And this is to do with Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. And this is about, the context is a meeting which the then Private Secretary to Gandhi, Pyare Lal, had with Ghaffar Khan. Pyare Lal admitted to Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan that Indians could not be exculpated from what Vinoba Bhave called in the language of the Bhagavad Gita the heinous sin of betrayal of one's friend and comrades. And Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, who sat near Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan in the working committee that approved partition, noticing his dejection, said to him, "You should now join the Muslim League." We all know this, that this transpired. Ghaffar Khan was pained to find how little his comrades understood what they had fought for all those years. How could they imagine that we would compromise our principles for the sake of power? Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan recalled those days. This is the line I actually wanted to read. When he could have asked the Muslim League for anything if only he had severed his connections with the Congress. Around 1930s, the Muslim League had done its best to see that he joins them, but he didn't. And now you have a man who perhaps had no mass base amongst the Muslims, Abul Kalam Azad, who asks him to go and join the Muslim League. Then there's another very touching thing. He says, Khan felt grievously let down by Congress leaders who had assured him that they would never accept partition. The Khudai Khidmat guards were not even given any advance notice. Instead, they were asked to fend for themselves, leaving them completely in lurch. I was in Delhi at that time, said Ghaffar Khan, yet nobody whispered a word to me. And now see the result. The Congress leaders thought that by accepting partition, they would have peace. The hatchet would be buried for good. But how can you expect love to sprout? This is what I wanted to read. Love to sprout from the seeds of hatred. What had been founded on hatred can be sustained also by hate. I mean, what was Muslim League after all? Muslim League was not a political organization. Muslim League was a movement which was based on religious passions. And the civil disobedience movement in Northwest Frontier Province, which they had started from March 1947 onwards, was actually not against the British. It was against the Congress. Then I come across another letter which the then Congress President Acharya Kripalani had written. And he says, Kripalani of course had no objection to the referendum taking place, as that was his party line. Rather relieved and casual, he said to Mountbatten that Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan and his followers' boycott of the referendum would only ease the situation, though the province may be lost to the Congress. This was a display of, to me, it's a display of utter callousness, reflective of the Congress top brass's thinking on a very serious issue. To further put Mountbatten at ease, Kripalani informed him that the Congress had no intention of sending anyone from outside the province to influence voters there for this referendum. The Congress chief also advised Ghaffar Khan to avoid electioneering speeches. Clearly, for reasons best known to them, the Congress leadership had decided to let the province go to Pakistan. Kripalani concluded his letter to Mountbatten with a promise that the Congress was very anxious that whatever might be done in the frontier province, it should in no way be in opposition to the working out of the plan we have agreed to. So, ladies and gentlemen, we very perhaps knowingly had let this province go to Pakistan. There are 2 or 3 more. Are we, Constantino, are we sort of 5 more minutes? So 3 or 4 more points I'll make, and then I'll finish. One is that Balochistan, I just missed it, therefore I'm coming back to Balochistan. And Balochistan at that particular point of time had actually wanted to refer their case to the United Nations. As I had said, that Balochistan was recognized by Pakistan. I mean, why didn't we support this move of the Khan of Kalat to refer the case to United Nations? I mean, these are all questions which arise in hindsight, and you can easily say that, you know, what if doesn't really make for a good argument. But the fact of the matter is we made things easier. Then, of course, on March 27th, till which time the Khan of Kalat had not acceded to Pakistan, there was actually a broadcast in on All India Radio, which said that VP Menon, the man in charge of the Ministry of States those days, had said that the Khan of Kalat had made overtures to India for ceding to India, which of course incensed the Khan of Kalat. And this was further confounded by a statement which Nehru made in the parliament on 30th of the same month, saying that all this is wrong, there's no such thing like that. And of course Mountbatten said that earlier on, yes, they had wanted some kind of a political relationship with us, but we said no to it. So all this confounded the situation from our side so much that already there was so much of political pressure being put, and the Pakistani army, the Jhob militia and all, had moved into areas of Balochistan, especially areas of Makran and Las Bela and Kharan. So the Khan of Kalat went ahead and sort of signed a treaty of accession. Though subsequently also he tried his level best to get out of the clutches, but he couldn't. So since it was not a very structured kind of a address of mine, I may have missed out a lot of things. I would much rather that while we are interacting and there are questions forthcoming, I could come out with my responses. Thank you.
Great, so the mic's on? Hello? Yeah? Working? Okay. So thank you, sir. Great, I think, summary of your main points and provocative points, I have to say, some of them, which at least would meet back the immediate question, why? I think when, as a student of political science, when you suggest states do something which is not in their best interest, which you seem to suggest, you gave up on something, you didn't pursue a policy in India's best interest, if I read you right, my question would be immediately why? Is it an issue of capacity? Could you have done more? What, if you could have, why not? Right? That is the first question, because I think that will come up, but that might come up, and at least I'd like to have your perspective on that. But we'll open up the discussion here to the panel, and it's great to have Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon with us. He's a distinguished fellow here at Brookings India, and I think no one better really to walk us through many of these issues into the present, because in reverse of a temporal order, he served as High Commissioner to Pakistan, 2003 to 2006. He was in China as ambassador between 2000 and 2003, and then Foreign Secretary 2006 to 9, and then from 9 or 10 to 14, the National Security Advisor in India. It's also a great pleasure to host Shanti. Dr. Shanti Maria de Souza is an old friend and colleague, is really the person who's done the best work on Afghanistan here in India. She had extensive field work in Afghanistan, conducted work around the country, well beyond Kabul, which is something which is rare. You've met really the actors across the country. She's now a faculty in Defense and Strategic Studies, a member of the Research and Advisory Committee of the Naval War College in Goa, where she's based. She was previously a research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies, the National University of Singapore, and also an associate fellow at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis here in Delhi, and also a JNU graduate like me. Most importantly, in her Afghanistan experience, Shanti worked as for the Independent Directorate of Local Governance in Afghanistan, as an election observer for the Afghan presidential election 2014, as a transition consultant for the United Nations Mine Action Service, and various other capacities for several NGOs and governments and multilateral agencies in Afghanistan. So we'll open this up. Sir, maybe we'll start with you. Maybe you want to take my question on why. Do you think there would have been a case for India to do more, and who failed in its obligations?
Well, you know, it's, I must thank Raghvendra, because he's done a book which nobody else has done in India or abroad that it's a real treasure trove of information. And he's organized it in an interesting way. He's done it by personalities. So you don't end up with Rashomon, luckily, but you do have a chance of seeing how the same events were regarded by each of the actors, whether it's Mountbatten, whether it's Badshah Khan, whether it's, you know, Khan Sahib, Dr. Khan Sahib, whether it's Nehru, and also to see how they chose to make, why they made these choices. I think the brunt of his argument that why did we insist, why did the Congress, and India therefore, because it was a Congress government, accept the idea of a referendum in NWFP. When they had the government, they just won an election, and then left their own people in the lurch to boycott the referendum, thereby making sure that the Muslim League would win and NWFP would end up in Pakistan. And insisted that the referendum also only have two choices, Pakistan or India, when at the same time Afghanistan had already said the Durand Line is not our boundary, that we have a say because the same ethnicity, and demanded that actually the tribes a say in their future. All that was ignored.
Why?
For me, the only explanation is they were so nervous of the choice of independence for other states in India, for Hyderabad, for Kashmir, for the possibility that any other state with a border with anywhere else, or even without a border, would choose to go elsewhere, and that India would therefore be balkanized, broken up. For me, that's the only reason that I can think of for them to accept the partition plan in the form in which Mountbatten sold it to Nehru on the 3rd of June in Shimla in 1947. And for not just him, but then immediately the leadership, the working committee, by the 20th of June, it was a done deal. And Jinnah had more trouble with it, actually, when they brought it to the interim cabinet. And so that's the only explanation I can think of. But the consequences are tragic. And that's what the book really brings out, of what happened to the Pashtuns, to Badshah Khan, to the Khudai Khidmat Gars, to the whole movement. And you know, I mean, I can vouch for this personally. In 2005, Wali Khan's funeral in Peshawar, a sea of red shirts. And when we went, and the moment word spread, you know, Hindustan ke Safir aaye hain, my feet didn't touch the ground. And you were sort of carried on this wave of emotion to the graveside. And all the ISI fellows and the Pakistani security all left behind, I mean, long gone. But it's incredible, the upsurge of emotion. That's after betrayal, after, you know, what, 60 years of being integrated into Pakistan and being part of Pakistani politics. It's an amazing feeling. Now, and this actually brings me to what's the value of this book? It tells you the story of the past, and for me, anybody who loses their memory of the past actually is doing themselves, is condemned to probably repeat it all over again. But luckily, Raghvendra has given us our past back in a form that we can actually access and so on. So where do we go from here? Today there isn't a boundary in the world which is where it was 200 years ago. Not one. Not even the US-Canada boundary is where it was 200 years ago. What Raghvendra reminds us is how complicated the present borders, not even the boundaries, but the borders in our part of the world are. And certainly, whether it's Balochistan, whether it's NWFP, whether it's Betrayal, whether it's Balochistan, when you look at the ethnicities, when you look at the forces which have now been unleashed in Afghanistan, you might call them whatever, and it's very easy to label everything terrorism and religious fundamentalism. It's actually much more complicated. And there's a whole set of dynamics at work there in Pakistan, across the Durand Line, which frankly make the Durand Line, it doesn't exist in practice. I mean, you've seen it. And not just Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, but everybody will tell you that it doesn't exist in their minds. So you have a situation which is increasingly fluid again, in every sense, politically, socially, in terms of religious affiliations, in every which way. And so for me, that's why this is a valuable book, because it actually opens your mind to a whole set of possibilities. I'm not saying that any of us know where this is going to end up. And it's not going to be easy, it's going to have cost, human lives, everything. But that at least you can now start thinking in a slightly broader and informed manner about where this will go. And that's really why I would really recommend this book to everyone.
Thanks. Just on that note, Shani, if you allow me, just quickly, Mr. Singh, I think on borders, let me just quote from your book. You say, 1947, quote, the British again drew an artificial frontier. 5 dividing lines you mentioned across the northwest and the north. And you mentioned them as fractious, unnatural. The Durand Line is fabricated, drawn arbitrarily, a compromise solution based upon British strategic and administrative expediency, not upon tradition or custom. Later on, you mentioned the Radcliffe Line as an act, quote, of near unbelievable insensitivity and administrative arbitrariness. And my question for you is, in that sense, is all borders are artificial. I think we can agree on that, right?
Boundaries are artificial.
Sorry?
Boundaries are
all
artificial.
boundaries and political boundaries.
Borders,
yes.
no.
And frontier zones are, therefore, they're subjective. Are we, as Mr. Menon mentions, I think, is there scope to think of these frontier areas differently today? And is that a result of this messy decolonization project, which you say served British interest? You make that very clear.
You know, when you talk of most of these boundaries, especially I'm talking about our colonial past and some of the other countries which were similar in nature, like the British gave us. You know, the thing is that it becomes a kind of a heirloom, and once it becomes a kind of an heirloom, then you actually tend to keep it to yourself, and it's sort of, for good or for bad, it keeps on, the problems actually keep on occurring and reoccurring. Say for example, in Kashmir, if you see, what has happened? There's an LOC which is there, and then this LOC got created because we didn't know what was happening. That's what Nehru said, that we were busy in so many other things, right, that we didn't have time. And that's the reason why I said that the whole thing got compressed. Even Radcliffe drew that line without actually getting to know what India is, and we agreed and conceded and let that be. what it is as of today. And that what if of history, and I'll just put all these things together. Again, Dr. Karan Singh told me that that there was this gentleman called Colonel Narayan Singh, who came to his father, and he was actually going to go to Kohala, and Kohala was the bridge which the state forces were to go and resist the Lashkars from coming in. So his father asked him, Hari Singh, that look, Narayan, do you want me to change the nature of your state force? Meaning there were Muslims in it. So he says, no, I don't. Actually, I trust them more than I trust the Hindus. And he went. And it's no secret, we all know that eventually the whole Hindu contingent, including him, was butchered by the Muslim part of the state forces. Now, why had he said that? He had said that because, just before he was going there, he'd come back from the Second World War, and he had sort of on the Burma front fought together. So that regiment of which he was a part of was more than a family. Obviously more than a family. You see deaths, you see so many travails, etc., etc. So, that regiment is even more well knit to my mind than a family. Then why does this happen? Right? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that, frankly speaking, that within a family you start killing each other. I mean, then I start questioning that all that highfalutin notions of secularism, etc., which we talk about, and a middle class phenomenon where, in Balochistan and Northwest Frontier Province, there was no middle class to talk about. So where was this question of the phenomenon of communalism as per the modern concept of communalism? So we end up actually with what if, with a kind of a boundary which is not given to us, and we are left sort of how should I put it? We are
exposed to that.
Yeah, we left. Yeah.
Well, that's it. British, and I quote again, it suited Britain to partition India. So your words, and I think what you meant is a temporal.
No, the reason why it suited was that they now needed to shift to Middle East after this was going, because this was a known fact that this is going. So now they have to basically save whatever interest they have and the emerging factors in the Middle East, whether it's the air routes, whether it's the oil, whether it's the ending of the mandate in Iraq or Aden Protectorate.
But to what extent are you exaggerating there, if I may say? So the agency the British had on all this. To what extent, the question of why us, Mr. Menon, applies to you, would have been feasible for India? Was India, on one hand you suggest there was a responsibility between Prime Minister Nehru and India. On the other hand, the British were to be blamed.
Why hurry it? That's the question. You see, Wavell didn't pull along well with anyone over here. He didn't pull along well with Gandhi. He didn't pull along well with Nehru. I mean, he had to go back. In fact, he comes out as a very tragic character in my book, and he was the one who said that we need to have a phased withdrawal, and as opposed to that, you have the swashbuckling Mountbatten who comes here, gets to know everyone, and does what he does to us, and we are left praising him. I mean, in the sense that around 47, when all this was happening with Kashmir, I mean, he is ready to get Attlee in. He is asking Attlee to come and see that we don't go to war with each other. Again, when the Indian army is on offensive in Kashmir in around June, July, August, again he does the same thing. He writes a letter, he sort of comes here and he sort of sees to it that we stop at a particular point. Whether we would have been successful or not is a different thing altogether. But the British army officers, they were all speaking to each other, and they were speaking to Mountbatten and what have you. So
which I think speaks also to the different tensions between headquarters London global imperatives, and the Raj's local administrative military service, which had sometimes very different nuances and was pushing maybe for a longer extended decolonization period. But Shanti, if we may now bring it a bit to the present, and what's your perspective on the book? What does this tell us, say, about issues like Durand Line, India's interests in the broader AFPAT region since then?
I think it's a very significant and important work. It's very timely, given that there's a gap in research in understanding the historical and the ethnographic details of this area. So this book actually fills in that critical gap, and I think it's just not the lost frontier, it's lost and found frontier after this book, because it's added so much of knowledge and so much, it's a treasure trove, has been rightly pointed out. When you look at Afghanistan from Indian perspective, I think there's lack of understanding of what actually is happening on the Durand Line, and there's not much of archival work done there as well. And given that the contentious nature of the boundaries and the historical legacies associated with it, Durand Line remains a problem area. For one, it has divided the largest ethnic group in Afghanistan, that's the Pashtun, into two. Second, because of that kind of allegiance, and the fact that the book also talks about is the tribal networks, which is not really studied in India. We don't have much study in terms of the sociological or the anthropological perspective of why this insurgency has found a base in that area. Why is it that Pashtuns have this idea of Pashtunistan still alive? And why is it that Afghan government, whoever is in power, even if it's Taliban before 2001, never recognized the Durand Line? So I guess there is this whole questions which are not being answered and explored, and thereby we lack an understanding of how things unfold in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. More importantly, I think this book also sets the stage for understanding the difficult Afghanistan-Pakistan relations, and that primarily comes from the fact that Pakistan has used the Pashtun card to its advantage at many points in time. It has used border closures, and which has significantly affected Afghan trade in the 1960s and still does that. India can't have trade the way it should have been between South Asia and Central Asia, so the trade and transit is affected. So thereby this area remains very underdeveloped, and that I think has been a deliberate policy per se. And that has affected the security dynamics in the region to a significant extent. And also the fact that this book has pointed out on the role of the buffer zone, and that is now changing with Pakistan trying to fence it and mainstream the tribal areas. I think there are more problems coming out of this. So on the whole, I think we need to look at Afghanistan as it's evolving, both in the aspect of the Durand Line, and I think more study has to be done on that, and also the fact that these ethnic groups have not been studied and not least understood.
Great, Shanti. On the developmental issues, sir, for you, I think important on the question on Pakistan's developmental priorities, just putting it into economics and geostrategy, and CPEC in particular. To what extent is Pakistan divorcing itself from South Asia over the last few years through this China nexus, CPEC in particular, the Belt and Road Initiative? And to what extent is it limiting and changing India's interests in the area? Because you have in many ways a policy of disconnectivity, no incentive from the Pakistani state to look southeast, if you want. How is that affecting India's priorities, in Afghanistan, Pakistan?
Well, I think CPEC is only to my mind, the third attempt by Pakistan to, as you say, divorce from South Asia. First, of course, was under Bhutto after 71. When they faced a huge setback in South Asia, they saw, and he did the whole Islamic conference, etc., etc. And he tried, and Islamization basically was, in a sense, it was an Arabization of South Asian Islam in Pakistan. It was an attempt to create a West Asian identity for Pakistan. The second, of course, was, and that I think is what CPEC actually represent. When they saw India growing rapidly economically and the gap growing much further, and they weren't really sure of strategic depth in Afghanistan, they looked to Saudi Arabia, to West Asia basically, for support. Didn't get very much. in Kayani's time during, and therefore ended up actually relying on China to a much greater extent. They thought they could rely on other Western, which includes West Asia, but even further west, support, and seem to have been disappointed. So it's not just CPEC. I think it's part of a sense that South Asia for them is getting harder and harder. The more India's influence or India's growth, India pulls away economically from them, the harder it is. So I think that's true. But the problem there is, and this is why this is important, you know, if we have Pakistan between us and Central Asia and Afghanistan and our friends in West Asia, Pakistan has NWFP Afghanistan between them and the rest of the world, and Balochistan between them and the rest of the world, which is why CPEC projects have had to be renegotiated. If you look at the ones that have actually been implemented and the continuing troubles, you know, around Gwadar and the very tight security that they have to provide for the Chinese who are undertaking projects in these areas. So there is still an issue. And I'm not quite sure how they're going to deal with this. Just integrating it, creating a hard Pakistani state and using technology and sheer force and to try and integrate these areas is unlikely to be a lasting solution.
So, I mean, when Prime Minister Khan these days telling us it's useless to speak to India, he said this 2 days ago, I think.
That's today.
Yeah. But are the incentives, today correct, but are the incentives for the Pakistani state to find some solution in India lesser than ever these days because of this axis between China and the West? And therefore, is this reducing India's leverage, influence, and capacity, which was always limited, in Afghanistan?
You know, if you even tactically, from a Pakistani point of view, your utility to other people diminishes if you're not even talking to India, you don't appear to be reasonable, you appear to have so it actually makes sense to make offers, to appear reasonable towards India in order to make yourself attractive to other people.
Not these days.
Today, that depends on what India does. I mean, the agency in this case is with you. If you say, I won't talk to Pakistan, but, you know, on neither side is Kuti policy. You know, that's, for me, that's not. So but just in terms of leverage, I mean, it makes sense. And you saw what Pakistan did after Balochistan. I mean, they did everything possible to appear reasonable without actually making any concessions, anything real.
So throwing the ball into India's court on this issue of India's agency then, Modi's remarks about Balochistan 2016 Independence Day speech, the Shiv Sena MP recently in Rajya Sabha saying after Kashmir, now we'll have Balochistan next.
Or IAS officers writing books on NWFP.
Is that, and this discussion about intelligence operations in Pakistan, for example, the whole debate from withdrawal, right, bringing it up, bringing it down. To what extent is that stirring up the pot? Is it positive or negative for India's interests, given what you were saying about the agency India has?
Most of these are just facts. If they're part of a strategy, of a larger policy, then they mean something.
Which would look
if
like?
If they're just individual instances and facts. No.
What would a strategy, what would such an offensive strategy look like?
You have 5 hours to sit and go.
No, but where would that
fit? It's a much more complicated thing. Then it includes a whole set of elements about, as he said, you know, your maps, your stance on Gilgit, Chitral, your attitude to, you know, to the Durand Line, for instance. What you do with other countries, what you do on the ground, whether overt, covert. I mean, there's a whole set of things that you then start looking at.
I know you will reply to my next question. I'm not in government, but if you were in government, do you sense a strategy these days?
I won't be in government. Don't worry.
But it's a possibility that this is part of a larger strategy.
I don't.
It could be. It should be if it is.
You should ask somebody else.
Shanti, I think coming back to Afghanistan, we had yesterday a certain president of a certain very powerful country mentioning that the Hindus, they're the Muslims, Kashmir, that's the issue, and that could apply probably to many of the issues at which he's looking at in this region. In many ways, we've had the United States of America telling India for many years, stay away from Afghanistan, don't come in to disturb the Pakistanis who get very nervous when you come and do anything, even if it's building a poor well or irrigation system somewhere. Sometimes other tones, these days actually saying India's free riding, you should be doing more, you should be fighting ISIS in Afghanistan. So a bit of a contradictory voice there from the Americans, but the fact is we've reached 2019 now, and I think we was talking to you yesterday, India is left with very little options in Afghanistan. Do you agree with that? Is that?
Yeah, I think thanks for clarifying that it is the United States of America. I think we have left with very little options given the fact that I think last 18 years, India did considerably well in terms of investing in capacity building projects, doing infrastructure projects and all of that, which accrued tremendous amount of goodwill. But as things are changing on the ground, I think India's stakes are high, and the fact that there is a peace deal making in the process and one is not sure how it's going to unfold. The deadline is, the date is September 1st, and we are looking at it very closely now. If it is implemented, it will be an externally mediated peace deal, which I think will not be accepted broadly in Afghanistan, and for which I think India has to be prepared. And the second thing is, if US wants India to do more, it can't do more in terms of the security aspect, because initially India wanted to, but the Americans didn't want it, and now they want it, and India is not ready to do it, rightfully so, because we can't put boots on ground in Afghanistan, and other than that, we don't have much significant say in political matters at the moment, given the fact that the elections were not held and they were delayed, and we still yet don't know whether it will be held on September 28th. So there's a lot of political uncertainty revolving around Afghanistan, and India's policy has been to use its soft power approach, and as things are changing dramatically on the ground, they don't translate into hard power gains. So it's issue of dealing with events as they unfold, and that's how our policy has been. It's not been long term, and unfortunately I have to also say this, that India functioned very well under the US security umbrella, and now when it's shrinking or it's closing, that space is gone. So how does India function? India had signed an agreement on strategic partnership in 2011, which said that it will deal with all kinds of scenarios as they unfold. But beyond those rhetoric of supporting an Afghan government-led and owned peace processes and supporting the Afghan government, then really there doesn't seem to be any other strategy in place. And this government has finished its term, and it's not really a legitimate government today. And tomorrow, if they have to have a deal, they might have an interim government. And how does India deal with that? So I don't think we think long term. I don't think we really study our history well as well. So I think this work is important. We don't understand how those tribal networks work. Why did India open various channels of communications in the Pashtun areas, especially when the Taliban were sending their feelers? And how do you have a broad-based engagement? India has reached such a stage that even its traditional allies, the Northern Alliance itself, doesn't think India is a good friend to bank on. So I think our chips are down, and I think there needs to be a serious thinking of how you're going to deal with one, the peace deal, and the second, elections if they're going to be held.
Okay, again, counterfactual. What could have India done? Just don't like where did India fail? What could it have done? And number two, where do you see India in Afghanistan, say 2-3 months from now? What, just beyond wait and watch? Don't tell me wait and watch, because that's a default policy for any country, right?
Right. I think India could have done more in terms of institution building. India has provided significant amount of aid, so it is almost more than, I think the pledged amount is more than $3 billion US, but most of it is not spent. Secondly, we've given more money to projects, and we have bought in a lot of elite buy-in kind thing has occurred in the sense of giving projects to Afghans on their request, but they're really not accountability of how these projects work. So we didn't focus much on institution building. For instance, in the political sector, we helped build a parliament building, but who occupies the parliament, how elections are held? I mean, India didn't get into that. So what we are looking at today is a mess. It's a system which doesn't function, it doesn't deliver. You have a very centralized government which actually doesn't make any difference on the ground in terms of providing basic services. So I think India could have done more in terms of, one, increasing the aid in terms of building concrete institutions which would have withstood the test of time, And secondly is also to have a long-term planning with that country. It's not about 2 or 3 months. So we look at things at very short term. How do we react if a deal is signed and then it's implemented? Or what if the elections are held and it turns out to be messy? Or if elections are not held? But beyond that, in the next 2 to 3 years, how are things going to unfold? If there are no elections, there's going to be an interim government in place, and that will be a hand-picked government. And there would be some kind of Taliban in the government, and that would be in a power-sharing arrangement. How do you prevent submersion of these institutions, which are very weak at the moment, from a Taliban takeover gradually in 2 to 3 years? So I think India has to emphasize on the need to hold elections, however difficult and faulty they will be, because without that, any deal will not be implemented, and secondly, it won't be accepted.
So on this actually, going back to the very old debate about good Taliban and bad Taliban, you may remember a few years ago. Let me quote from Shamsaran's piece, from Ambassador Shamsaran, I think he's here. So he wrote in February 2019, I'll quote, bottom line, this is this year, India's interest is preventing a complete Taliban takeover in Kabul, though a government including Taliban elements may have to be tolerated. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think so, because it depends on how you have the elections and how you have the government in place. If it's a hand-picked government and you have the Taliban signing the deal with the interim government and takes certain ministries or wants to be have the presidential post and is ready to give the prime minister's post. I mean, these are things they've been talking about in Doha. It depends on how that is going to unfold. So I think our institutional checks need to be in place to prevent that takeover, complete takeover. But we cannot prevent some form of Taliban coming back at this point of time. I agree with that. So what I think we need to do in the long term is look at how the elections are going to be held and insist on the elections being held, because then we'll have some checks and balances rather than interim government with power sharing arrangement with the Taliban.
And I think this is also, people like to dismiss sometimes the sort of India focusing on elections as an excuse, as just kicking the can down the road. But there is, I don't know, sir, if you agree, but there's a certain theme I've noticed in the neighborhood that elections play a revitalizing role. And sometimes you hold election after election until you get it right. I'm thinking of Nepal for many years in the Constituent Assembly.
We've seen Bangladesh. We've seen
India insisting election as a almost purifying mechanism until you get it right, which may take years. Do you agree with that, sir? Are elections from the Indian perspective?
Case, yes, I think that's part of the solution, but that's only one small part. I think you also need to look at how has power been distributed in Afghanistan, in reality. I mean, forget about notionally and institutions and constitution. And the government in Kabul has always been weak. It's not only this government or Karzai's government, but even historically, if you look back, where even the Iron Emir, he had limits on what he could do. And power has always been disaggregated in a sense. And so I'm not sure the Americans withdraw. I've always argued from our point of view, actually, if it were done, to a best that were done quickly, as Lady Macbeth said. Please go there. This interim transition is the worst, where everybody, whether it's Pakistan, China, everybody else, games the American withdrawal and the negotiation. Whereas once the Americans withdraw, everybody has to take responsibility for what they face, for the situation. And it seems to me the most likely outcome is not some strong central Taliban-controlled government in the center, but the normal pattern in Afghanistan, the power being distributed between tribes, between regional leaders, between whatever, ethnic leaders, whatever, and a weak central government, and especially if it's a coalition including the Taliban and various other people. Because this is not the same Afghanistan as the Afghanistan of 1996. It has changed and evolved. So in that case, that's going to be a weak government busy fighting among itself. And I'm not sure that Afghanistan is going to be run out of Kabul in the immediate future, immediate aftermath of an American withdrawal. And I'm not sure how Pakistan is going to cope with the consequences of an American withdrawal. I think for them, actually, this is the ideal situation where they can claim to have influence and offer themselves as brokers to the Americans and so on. But that goes. once
But
the Americans withdraw.
To both of you, quick question. How did it come that India is not involved in this? How is India at the sidelines of a major transformation in its neighborhood?
Because you're not there on the ground and you have no access. That's why I say you have to be a realist and about how power is actually exercised and distributed in Afghanistan. And I think you have to accept that fact.
Was it a conscious policy of India to staying away? Were you
No,
forced? Were you kept out?
I think we were there when it was possible, when circumstances made it possible. But today is, frankly, it's a situation where force is determining who controls what and who determines. And I think that's what is happening right now. You have not done what you could have done when you said what were the alternatives, which is work with Iran and get assured access and use that access to actually develop influence and a role. But that you didn't do, you chose not to do.
Well, on that, actually, let me quote from another colleague of mine, Avinash Paliwal, my enemy's enemy.
He has bits that, yeah.
Well, he mentions someone, a certain Menon.
Yeah, I wonder who.
The master stroke was Menon's decision to involve China and use Beijing's leverage over Islamabad and Rawalpindi to convince or coerce the Taliban to the talking table. It was 13, 14 he's talking about.
13, 14 actually.
Where's this capacity which India had in 14, 15? Oh, does it have?
Well, you know.
You're both saying it doesn't, but does it?
No, at that time, it wasn't just a matter of force. It was at that time, in fact, we had trilateral talks with the Russians, the Chinese about what was happening. And the Afghans then participated in the talks as well. We did 2 or 3 rounds of those kinds of discussions. But that was a very different time.
That stopped?
Even though, and there again, it was because President Obama had set a date for a withdrawal that suddenly everybody stepped up and became responsible because they realized they'd have to deal with the consequences.
So inshallah, these days we have other master strokes happening in the background and someone will write about it.
We don't, look, never assume that what you don't see is not happening. I mean,
that's what we're here for. 50 years later, we'll write about it.
Or what was it? The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, wasn't it? As a certain
Shani,
thing.
in Afghanistan, what's the goodwill these days? You meet a lot with Afghan people from across the government. Is there a sense of disappointment, of fatalism? Will we have the same accusation saying they've ditched us? Like Ghaffar Khan, who came to Delhi and said, will we hear the same thing a few years from now?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's significant goodwill still existing, but I think we also have raised the bar high. The expectations level have increased. And for instance, when you talk to the security personnel, they expect more aid from India, more training, more equipment. So there's always that wish list which comes, in terms of wanting more from India. And secondly, I think even the statements made, like for instance on Balochistan, you raise that expectation and then you don't match it. So that expectation gap has fed in, and there's a kind of disappointment that India doesn't do more now. And thirdly, India has done large-scale projects in northern Afghanistan and not in Pashtun areas, which are very difficult and insecure. So there is that disconnect there. So there is a sense that there's more being done in the north and not being done in this area, especially in the south and east. So they actually, even the Pashtuns want India to do more. So the thing is, they want India to do more, and the fact that India doesn't do much has fed into that disappointment circle. I think it's also a function of the fact that Afghanistan is of secondary importance to India in its policy-making circles, and that I got a sense from talking to people in MEA at various points of time. And on the mission, in the ground there's tremendous work being done, and there's a good connect between the embassy and the Afghans in terms of the visas and all this wish list that people have, but the scale is so huge, you can't fulfill that expectation, and that leads to problems. So somewhere down the line, I think India has to be realistic about doing things which are useful, one for Afghans, and secondly for Indians themselves, and not having such broad-based engagement which we have been doing all over Afghanistan. So I think from now on, we'll have to get very specific about how to do things and how to make it useful. The economic projects, like for instance, you have factories, you have handicraft training capacity programs and all of that. So you have actually trained women, but they don't have access to markets to sell their goods. So they don't know where to sell. How
But
to
all
get-
that will blow up if you have a situation of a conflict re-emerging within maybe months.
Yeah, but I'm saying
That
now,
civilian
as
presence.
you meet people now, so I'm just talking about that expectation gap and the disappointment that India hasn't done much, and that also feeds in what happened historically, right? During the Soviet intervention, we didn't take a position. That goes to that kind of thinking, you know, of will India stand by us when things go bad, and what will India do, and whether India can do more. That's the question.
Mr. Singh, last question before we come back to your book, and it'll be a very personal political question. Hopefully you'll take it. And you served as a private secretary to Mr. Jaswant Singh for 10 years. And I remember reading and Jaswant Singh, still a student, and working for Stephen Cohen, professor at Brookings India, who was an RA too, and all of us, and he was a big fan of Jaswant Singh's thinking, in particular, and this has got Mr. Jaswant Singh into trouble, as you know, eventually, about this larger India, about this greater India, which somehow was lost in history, which was given up. It came up at your Nehru Memorial book launch also when the discussion was about India's imperial outlook, India's geostrategic imperial. How did it become so insulated, so cocooned, so insular in its outlook over the last 70 years? Do you agree with that? Is that something which animates your book, that we need to enlarge in India's frontiers? And second, if that is, and I assume it is, how to achieve this? One is through the classic power projection, security, politics, intelligence, right, which we see a lot these days. What about the language of integration, economic integration, connectivity, and India achieving not an extension of its borders to security, politics, and hard power, but to soft power, economics, what Shanti was saying, which was so appreciated in Afghanistan, which really tied Afghanistan to India over the last 20 years now, probably. Which is the best way to achieve that?
On the first question, when he was doing his book on Jinnah, is that what you want to ask me about? I was actually working with him on that book. To my mind, I think there is really nothing in that book which is objectionable. Really nothing. What happens is that when you try and make stories, maybe the publishers want to do it to sell the book, or some people want to write or come out with excerpts to catch the eye. So I think it got into that. That is, if at all. I don't know. I mean, I was not privy to what went on in the meetings, etc. But it got unnecessarily sensationalized. I don't think so. There's even one paragraph of that book which can be termed as controversial. The reason is that even in my book, you see, when I write, I put the facts on the table, right? I'm not sort of qualifying them, but this is what I think is correct, or this is what I think is wrong. I mean, the facts are there, from where I've sourced them is there. You see it for yourself and you decide. And that's
absolutely, but I think we also should not be an illusion that it's just a neutral collection of facts. Every book has a history, has an idea behind it. I can see it given who you worked for, who you worked with, your trajectory, the messages in your book. There is a certain idea, and this is a big debate today within the center-right and the BJP in particular, about a greater India, how to achieve it. And it's a very fractious issue in that political family in this country. It goes back to the early 2000s, and the Jinnah book is an example of that.
On the second one.
Yes.
On the second one now, you see, if you think what I think of what should happen. Now, I've been actually talking about this in various circles, which are into policy making. And I've said that, look, we need to have a proper, you see, suppose, I mean, I was in National Archives, which you mentioned of. Suppose if you go and completely digitize that, 1 crore pages are digitized. Now, you see, unless you have proper metadata for it, how do you know what has to be accessed? So, to my mind, instead of doing that, each MEA, say for example, I mean, I was just speaking to Ambassador Menon, and he said that, look, there are certain documents which exist there, but obviously they have not been declassified and handed over. More than 70 years passed. So, what is happening to that, right? So, the idea is someone should go put those things in perspective instead of having them in silos of Ministry of Defense or Ministry of External Affairs or Home Affairs or what have you. You put them 10,000 pages together so that you see the half-truths, you see, which are proffered by various other countries when we go and sort of, whether it's to do with Gilgit, whether it's to do with POK, whether it's to do with Tibet, or whether it's so that then actually gets countered, I mean, even in terms of cartography and what have you. So that is what I personally feel.
Good. So you've not answered the political question, but you gave me a better answer on the importance of history in terms of recreating that greater India and that larger perspective as ammunition for diplomatic battles, political battles, and social science, knowledge battles, which are important to be fought. And in a democracy, you expect them to be there, which have to be based on evidence, whether it's cartographic, scholarly, declassified archives. And that is, I think, an appeal you make, which at least is also close to my heart. I think many people here in the room which have benefited a lot from the archives, which are becoming, fortunately, more open and transparent. I hope you agree that the debate was interesting, exciting, but we'll open it up, and therefore we sacrifice a bit of the Q&A time, but let's spend another 10 to 15 minutes on maybe one round of larger questions. Please make them short, identify yourself, and make them targeted to one speaker, ideally, so we can focus this debate in a most productive way. You guys up first. Thank you.
It was a very interesting presentation, and one of the interesting facts you brought in is that the date of independence was advanced. To that, I want to bring the people back into the conversation.
A short question, please.
Yeah. The main issue is we all know that 5 to 10 lakhs people were killed during the partition, and there is no satisfactory explanation, and we came to know that there was no plan for partition. So when you have answered to some extent that the date was advanced and there is no proper plan for the partition, then do you think that was responsible for this massive killing and massacre?
Thank you. Yes, please. Please identify yourself.
Hello, thanks for the presentation. My name is Kamal. I work for the Economist Intelligence Unit. My question is related to Ambassador Menon's comment that we might actually see Afghanistan not being run from Kabul after the ongoing process is done. Sir, my question is, how bad really can it get with a US withdrawal? Because bulk of the fighting right now is happening with the Afghan security forces on the ground. So with good enough training, with intelligence support, and maybe with some air power, can the Afghan security forces actually hold on to where they are? Yeah.
I would just add to that, if you would like to comment, sir, the abrogation of 370, to what extent did the geostrategic situation and reading possibly matter in this constitutional change?
Okay, I'm Gerald Chopra. I'm very happy you wrote this book because I am from the NWFP. I'm from Mansehra, Hyderabad, close to Balakot, where the thing actually took place. Anyway, since we're talking history, I'll come back to the author. We've had a lot of discussion with the ambassador and Shanti. Now, what if we had got NWFP, the Congress would have got NWFP, we would have been in a situation, one unviable East Pakistan and one unviable Indian NWFP, which becomes part of this greater India that you are all talking about now. We would have had, in my view, a Bangladesh by Pakistan in the NWFP. There have been more tensions and there have been further problems. I'm not going to talk about the Holocaust. I've been through it. And on Afghanistan, just very quickly, yes, we have to talk to the Taliban. That is the channel we should have never given up. I mean, I have served in Nagaland, Mizoram in the early 50s. We made friends with the leader of the underground in Mizoram, made him the chief minister, Al Denga. We made Kivyozi the underground leader, chief minister of Nagaland. Well, we do that in Nagaland, we do that in Mizoram. Afghans are equally our friends. Why are we not doing it with them? And for Pakistan, when you say what was going to happen, I think they are going to go towards the blacklist. And the word I want to use is extricate, which Trump has used. It's not a drawdown, it's not a withdrawal. They're extricating, which gives leverage to Pakistan. No matter what you do now, Pakistan is going to exploit this leverage. Thank you.
Mr. Mantai had a question whether he left the room. Yes, sir.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask a very brief question because time is limited. You must have consulted a vast amount of documentation from the archives.
No, on this issue, not much. Though there is a lot, because when I actually started doing it, I found, frankly
what I
speaking,
want to ask you is, what do you do when the documents you want to read are classified and not released for public? For example, Shiv Shankar Menon in his book, he has used documentation which is not available to the public. Right? So what do I do?
They were stored in the mind.
No, I was
Primary source.
working on a paper on India-Pakistan, India-China border conflict, and I wanted to look at certain documents of the British period. It's not available. They are in the Ministry of External Affairs, I'm told. Why can't we keep release documents like the British do or other countries do? When documents are over 30 years old, why do you keep them secret and top secret? I don't find it easy for researchers to work in India.
Behind you, sir.
Good evening. My name is Deepak and I'm an IIS student from the South Asian University. My question is to Ambassador Menon. So when we talk about engaging with the Afghanistan in a realistic manner, so is it not going against India's traditional stance against having a boots on the ground policy? Because I think one of the reasons why we've never focused on such a policy in Afghanistan is also based on the Lankan experience which we had. And now what you say is right, like we risk getting sidelined if we don't follow such a proactive policy. But we have changed some of the things, like with respect to the defense deals which we are having. We've been sending them offensive weapons like attack helicopters. So could this be a realistic step, or rather engage more proactively, like boots on the ground?
Good.
Thank you.
So we have a good collection. We have exactly 9 minutes, so I'd say 3 minutes each around. If you want to make any comments, replies, maybe we'll start with you, Mrs. Singh.
Now, your question first, because this is easily answered. I actually hadn't consulted the archives. The reason is that if you are not in the archives, this is how the things pan out. When you pass by the archive, the first thing you see is that there are these uniformed personnel who sit there. The whole bloody thing looks so daunting that you don't feel like actually entering it. So half of us would actually get frightened away from sort of entering that building, which is directly supervised by Lutyens and Baker. And as far as the classified documents are concerned, they are like blips. So, and we in any case are very loath to declassify. We'd much rather keep it in our archives, our own departmental archives, and not declassify it. And not that everyone's sort of going and consulting it every second day. No one consults it for 40 years, 50 years, but still keeps on lying. But that's a question of, how should I put it, habit.
I don't know why the MA is keeping these documents top secret.
Shall I?
Yeah, please.
Why not?
No, I think the MA line is very simple. We tried to declassify a fair amount. Live issues like India-China boundary, J&K, live issues we have not declassified. And there's very little chance that we'll ever get political approval to actually declassify those. I think because, for obvious reasons. And also, I'll tell you one reason. As long as you're still dealing with an issue, say the India-China boundary, you cannot have an honest discussion within government. You can't write the honest truth in your notes and so on. If tomorrow it's going to be public, whether through RTI or anything else. And what you want is an actual honest examination of at least within government you should be truthful to yourself. And you should argue. You must have that discussion. You don't want just the party line stuck forever. So for me, for some of these issues, which are highly politically sensitive, which are still very live, which involve neighbors like, you know, China, Pakistan, I think it's unlikely that you'll get them until you get some resolution of these. And you've moved. If you get a settlement of the India-China boundary, sure, I'm sure we'll release everything. But today there are, well, they don't give you everything, by the way. Please don't assume that these documents that the US or Britain, and they're very free with other people's documents. They're much less free with their own.
I think it's a larger discussion. I'm happy this is happening.
Yeah,
Very
but
happy.
by the way, I'm on your side. I've been arguing for many
Yes.
years that we should put things, I mean, Tino will,
And Mr. Menon,
and we did, thanks to Shamsaran,
yes.
who was here, we did start a whole process of opening up the MEA record rooms. We made it possible for outside researchers to come and sit there and use our documents.
Yes, absolutely. I'm a beneficiary of that. Many people here in the room, or we've quoted, or we show their books, they have been beneficiaries of that. I'd say to post 2009-10,
Yeah.
it's when it accelerated. I hear it's slowed down again, unfortunately. But there is, for those who are interested in the room, enough material, even if it's little,
there's lots of stuff.
to do a lot of work. And I'm glad to see many, many more people these days doing that work. You were there also in the National Archives, and you must have seen it. So please, you had, I think, two more questions.
So on your question, sir, about the migration of population, was it that?
The massacre, the Partition
Yeah.
massacre.
And the migration.
As you said that it was
Yeah.
advanced.
Yeah.
Had it been in 1948?
No, my basic thing is that if you have some time, and you know, the British are just sort of coming out of your country, and the law and order issue, the issue of communal conflagration, everything is sort of erupting at that particular point of time. Then a phased withdrawal over some period of time is a much better option, rather than, you know, you sort of compress everything in 2-3 months and try and sort of resolve it, because obviously you have only 24 hours in a day, and with the kind of system of governance we had, I mean, everyone was, you know, a lot was happening, basically, so to speak.
Because all British, was it all British to blame totally?
No, no.
Or the leadership when you were on our part?
You see, that's a complicated thing. I mean, you can't just sort of have a sweeping statement that the British were to be blamed, or the British bureaucracy along with the Indian bureaucracy, or what we missed out or what we didn't miss out. That's actually a separate debate, and let's not get into that. But the fact of the matter is that if we had some more time, we could have done the same thing much better. And taking cue from this, you know, the Northwest Frontier Province, had it come to India? No, that's not the question. The question is whether Kashmir, say for example, or Balochistan, or Northwest Frontier Province. You see, if within 3 months or 4 months things are changing, they could change again. So what is the point of, you know, taking it to a tipping point and then, you know, you just go like this? You know this is happening. I mean, it's just in 3 months' time, from March to July, you know, suddenly things have gone out of control in Northwest Frontier Province. Why not wait? Isn't it? So what's the hurry for, you know, having a date as 15th of August? Similarly with Balochistan. So, I mean, if you have that kind of, I mean, since Nehru considered himself to be an expert on foreign affairs, and so I'm sure the security aspects, etc. But at that particular point of time, if you consult whatever was you know, the correspondences between the British High Commission in say Lahore or Karachi or Rawalpindi and in Delhi, then you actually get privy to a lot of information which is usually not there, and there you find that these guys are saying something which is exactly the kind of trap we are falling into.
And my question was,
Please, we have to finish. Shall I up to you and then we finish with investment?
Running out of time.
Yeah, I know. Well, I think it was important to talk to the Taliban, and India should have retained that option, and that is a right question. But the fact is also, India also wanted to support the Afghan government processes, by which it didn't want to diverge from that stand. There were feelers from the ground which could have been kept open. And I think putting boots on the ground is not really an option because given the lessons we have had, and also the operational constraints of doing something like that. And more importantly, the goodwill, the social capital India has there would simply be lost. You would be party to the conflict and you would be involved in a war which is not really your war. So I think that will be unnecessary expenditure and a loss of goodwill. In terms of offensive capabilities, I think India could have done much more. I mean, these helicopters are useful, but they could have given much more in terms of training. And as rightly pointed out, India has this huge experience of dealing with counterinsurgency in its own theaters in Mizoram and Nagaland. And I think herein we could have worked with the Afghans on building a security grid, training them on counterinsurgency capabilities. What they've really been trained on has been more on conventional army terms, and they're actually fighting insurgency. So they're looking at CT plus when the insurgency is raging on the countryside, and the whole experiment India had, be it with Mizoram, Nagaland, and to a certain extent in Jammu and Kashmir, that wasn't really used in Afghanistan, which could have had some kind of parallels and some kind of lessons which could have helped Afghanistan. About Kabul and maintaining weak Kabul, I think that's historically true, but over time things have changed. You know, it's not the same state we are looking at. And given all the pessimistic reports you hear from Afghanistan, but there has been some progress, and I think there wouldn't be complete drawdown in that sense of losing that progress. But the dangers of subversion of that democratic experiment in terms of the political end state, for instance, if the Taliban come back, they will want some kind of constitutional reform. They want kind of an intra-Afghan dialogue, which has really not occurred. So if that doesn't occur, and if the Taliban do come back in some form, there will be a breakdown of the consensus, which is a recipe for a civil war. So we are looking at serious questions in Afghanistan, and I think over the next month or so, we'll know how things unfold, and maybe I can take questions later rather than keep talking. Thank you. Yes,
no, I agree with Shanti. Boots on the ground is not the issue. The resistance to our doing more, in fact, since 2011, we did start, training the Afghan National Army. We did also start supplying various things, attack helicopters, various things. The real resistance came from the US at Pakistani instance, because they didn't want us involved with the Afghans. And they actually capped even what ISAF was willing to do with the Afghans. After all, they gave the Afghans no air power. They gave them no intelligence capacity of their own, and they made sure that they controlled that entirely. So there was this, because ISAF felt it had to keep Pakistan on side in order to maintain their own lines of communication and supply, and there was this political imperative. So actually the Afghan army was left stunted and was prevented from getting help from those who were ready to help. So I think it's a more complicated thing than just, India didn't do what it should have done. There were times, and certainly we were willing to do much more on this front, but there was a lot of resistance. Where will it go? I agree with you. It's not going to just go back to 96 or to, it'll be much more complicated because it's a much more complicated society right now, and polity. But how bad can it get? I mean, none of us can really tell where it goes. Did the geostrategic situation influence the 370 decision? Ask the people who made the decision. I can't answer. I think that's it. One point about the massacres. From the British point of view, advancing the date was a great success. Not one Englishman was touched. And that's a remarkable thing, when hundreds of thousands are being killed.
One or two got killed in Kashmir.
But that was separate. That was nothing to do with partition violence.
But in the war.
In the war. That was in the war by mistake. I mean, they weren't supposed to be there. Anyway, that's a different story. Pasha and...
On the future-oriented note, sir, just India's options in Afghanistan, really, I mean, just that I can ask you.
Who?
What should India do now in Afghanistan?
Right now?
Yes.
I don't think we should get involved in this. We're not part of this process.
Wait and watch.
This process will collapse one way or the other in the face of reality. But the Americans will get out. Question is how much of a face saver they'll get. Once they're out, then we deal with it. Then other people will need us too.
Thank you. So, three thanks. Thanks to you for coming here today and to Brookings India. We hope to do many more of these events. Thank you to the panelists, to Ambassador Menon for joining us and taking time to be here. Dr. Souza, who came from Goa especially for this, and we're lucky to have you and hope to have you back here too more often, participating in our program events. And most importantly to Mr. Raghvendra Singh. So I think you've really paid service to many different causes, in particular the cause of scholarship, of history, of informed debate. I invite all of you to buy this book and read it. It's a wealth of information, history, and we only touched the surface really here today. And so I understand you want to write more books, so we hope to have you back on your future books about this.
Balochistan.
About Gilgit, Balochistan, a series of books. And most importantly, I think often we talk about revisionism as a bad word in history. I think you helped us to be revisionist today. I think revisionism is a need in history. We constantly need to question history, revise it, debate it. And I think you've helped us in that. So please join me in a hand for all the
To stay abreast of Afghanistan the way you do.
Love that country. It's my passion. Remember how much I troubled you those days? And you always were gracious.
I don't have a card. Yeah, it is RAGH. How are you, sir? I'll just give it. Congratulations. Sir, thank you for coming,
मैं
sir.
पहले नहीं आ पाया रही मेमोरियल है तो आई मस्ट मेक इट टुडे
आया था
कांग्रेचुलेशन
बहुत अच्छा लगा मैं देख रहा था आपको लगा कहीं ऐसा ना हो
Interesting book. Congratulations.
थैंक यू
My card.
थैंक यू
Both sides. We should meet sometime.
सर चल रहा है सर यहीं अभी रह रहा हूँ बिफोर आई मूव ऑन नहीं है यार मैं कार्ड बट आई गिव इट टू यू एक सेकंड जस्ट गिव मी 2 minutes एंड आई
दिल्ली में रहोगे
हाँ दिल्ली में ही रहूँगा सर बिकॉज यहाँ पूनम का एक छोटा सा घर है It is RAGH.
Working on archival.
RAGH. Or you take my phone number and give me a call. That's it. Sorry. It is 98180. 43424.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My name is Partition.
Give me a call anytime.
But the UN thing, I do believe. You better check with your
Well, we are frustrated because it's a matter of a small point of process at the end, which is now later.
I would have walked. I would have just walked away with this.
They're taping you. They're recording you.
Like you said,